Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of the Prospect Podcast. My name is Benjamin Clark and I'm joined today by Jerusalem Demsas. Jerusalem was a writer for Vox and for The Atlantic, but she has now charted a new boat, The Argument, out into the choppy seas of digital media. Jerusalem, give us the elevator pitch. What is The Argument?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. So, The Argument is a new magazine dedicated to revitalizing liberalism for the 21st century. And we use liberalism, depending on your audience here, much more in the British sense of the word than the American sense of the word. We include writers across the political spectrum, from socialists all the way to, conservatives and libertarians, people who maintain kind of affinity for and belief in like classic liberal principles around individual rights and free speech, but also want to see how arguments about how government should be able to engage to give people a better life. And I mean, it's called The Argument for a reason. A big part of what we do is argue with one another and also people outside of our institution about relevant policy areas that actually affect people's lives. One of the big theses that I had when I first started at The Argument was, that so many people who care about liberalism were doing it in such a boring way that they were just lecturing everyone about liberal democracy all the time. And, I'm like, I agree, like, yes, like everyone should read, J.S. Mill. Like, I would love for everyone to become, Amartya Sen pilled. Like, that would be fantastic. But I also just think that, like, more realistically and also just more, small d democratically, you should actually engage with the issues that people are telling you are important to them. Like, they don't want to talk about political philosophy. They want to talk about how your policy and your activism and your work is going to actually impact their lives on an affordability level, how you're going to think about big issues like the regulation of artificial intelligence and how that's going to affect their children. Like, should we allow artificial intelligence companies to engage in sexually explicit content with minors? Like, these are like real live questions that are affecting the well-being of people today. And liberalism has answers and also has, debates within it about what those answers should be. And so The Argument is the place to have that debate. We've platformed a lot of really interesting writers across the political spectrum to do it.
Yeah, interesting. So we'll get on to liberalism in a minute, but just like to keep on you for a second here. So you were at the Atlantic. Many people would see writing at the Atlantic being a kind of dream job. Like you had a great sort of platform there to write about some of the issues that you really care about and stuff. What made you want to sort of cast out and do your own thing? I guess I think we're like similar age here. Was it sort of like staring down 30 and you get that like weird kind of
That itch, yeah.
compulsion to just like, tear everything down? Or yeah. What was it that made you want to do your own thing?
Um, yeah, I love The Atlantic, and The Atlantic is obviously, and for any writer, it's like one of the dream magazine jobs to have as a staff writer there. I think that there are a few things going on. One is that, I think that there's almost like a temperamental thing where I get bored quite fast at what I'm doing. The longest job I ever had was The Atlantic, and I was there for 3 years. I like to try new things and work in different ways. And so I think that there's like a temperamental angle to it. And I think I've talked to a lot of people who are founders of different institutions and companies. And there's a level to which I think that that's just sort of like in the blood sometimes. There are people who are extremely successful and like very influential who have been writing at the same institutions for like 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. And they just are different temperamentally than like, I don't think I could ever do something like that. And so I think that's a big part of it. I think the second thing is that like, I felt that the level of, any institution that's been around as long as the Atlantic, in order to be as excellent as it is, requires like a ton of like bureaucracy and rules. And so if you're trying to move quickly, it can be difficult. It can be difficult for reasons that I think are completely valid. Like, you have to run things through a legal review. You have to have like top reads from editors. And to me, it's really exciting to start something where if you want to just try something, you can go ahead and do it. And so a big question was like, is the pitch that I'm making to investors, because we are a for-profit company, is that going to be interesting to them? And we were able to raise a little under $4 million for this. And it just gives you a bunch of freedom, like to have that kind of capital and to be able to say, like, I'm going to hire writers that I think are really fantastic. I'm going to commission them to write these ideas. I mean, it's a force multiplier for your own work. Like, when you're a staff writer, you're responsible for your own writing, and it's very freeing. Sometimes you're like, nothing else matters. I write my piece, I turn it in, like that's the whole thing. But here it's like, okay, like, yes, I have more responsibility, but also I get to help shape coverage and shape public debates in a way that I wouldn't be able to as an individual at a bigger institution.
So you've gone out and you've gotten this $4 million in funding. Are you feeling the pressure basically to sort of, generate a profit in the short term?
Yeah, so I was very upfront with all of our investors in our conversations that, like, it's digital media. Nobody expects this to be the kind of, return that they might make in other kind of venture capital investments. And so there's not like sort of, I don't feel that pressure. I do feel like I mean, part of why I made it a for-profit institution when I was thinking about whether or not to do a nonprofit or for-profit is I actually do think that that market discipline can be super helpful and clarifying for you as a founder when you're trying to develop an institution. Like right now, I have hired like 9 people, like people whose salaries depend on us being financially stable. And we have enough, runway for a significant amount of time. But like the goal is to be profitable in 3 years. And like that to me is like something that is achievable and possible. But depends on a lot of things that are both in your control and out of your control. But I think that like having that in your head at all times is really helpful, because I think that it can be really easy as a journalist to lose sight of the fact that you're not just writing into the ether. We're not like in, the academy where like we are, we're just in the pursuit of knowledge and just, hoping that, maybe one person reads our dissertation one day, but that it's all just contributing to this broader space of knowledge that is not really about affecting things right now. We're journalists where like people need to find value in what you're doing. Like there needs to be something that is valuable to readers, to the audience that you think is important. It needs to be influential in that way. And I'm not saying that like that's not possible at a nonprofit institution. Like obviously that is possible, and like there are many great nonprofit journalism outfits that do this. Like I think ProPublica is like one that like is like fantastic at this. But I think that is in some ways like the Particle discipline is like very hard to replicate if you are not used to running institutions. And this is the first time I've run anything, and so I felt that that was very important for me to have.
Yeah, sweet. And like you're obviously not the only person at the moment who has, gone from a traditional media job and started your own thing, right? And not just people doing their own like, single writer Substacks, for instance. Like there are loads of people in the last sort of year or two who've decided to found new publications, right? Like for instance, I had a chat earlier this year with Mehdi Hassan, who has made Zateo, which is a fairly big outlet now on Substack, sort of founded on the Substack platform. Like on the right, you could look at say like the Free Press, for instance, as another model, right? So like, why do you think that the media is like fragmenting in this way? And like, do you think it's a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, obviously, like, you think that your venture is like a good, right? But like, do you
Only
think
my
that
venture is good. No one else's venture is
yeah,
good.
if everyone else can swap
Um,
after you, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm now an incumbent, and I don't want any new entrants into this market. Yeah, so I think a few things. I mean, I think that like the story of media is like a story of like bundling, unbundling, rebundling, it's just like over and over and over again. And that's like that kind of there's a cyclical nature to it that I think is sort of like inevitable. And so we're seeing right now, I mean, I think Substack, but also for various other reasons, like the fact that I think the media, especially the news media ecosystem, has become much more influencery, which means that people have like sort of parasocial relationships with individual people, rather than just the institutions. Like I feel like when I was younger, I don't know if you feel this way too, I would not really pay attention to bylines like at all. Like I would just like I was like I read a piece in the New York Times, I read a piece in the Washington Post, I read a piece in like the Times. Like I mean, I didn't like pay attention. I mean, very rarely there are some people who like would really stand out to you, maybe that you would know, but like very rarely would that happen. And it was like with people's books, maybe that you would like learn about. Oh, that's a journalist who writes for this paper that I read. And that's changed a lot in the age of social media, where people really have and podcasts where people like really develop individual relationships and trust with people. I think like Ezra Klein is like probably the quintessential example of this at the New York Times, where people really are like, I want to hear what Ezra Klein has to say. Like that is important to me to learn about the world and his perspective in order to understand the world, but also to like think more about what I believe. I trust how he is doing journalism. And that sort of thing I think has like really changed media, where like obviously, institutions are still really valuable as both like the actual resources they provide to journalists, but also the institutional credibility they can give. Like, this is not just a journalist; it's also a journalist at the Atlantic. It's been vetted by this institution, et cetera. It's empowered, I think, individuals to really go off on their own to make a name for themselves, and I think that unbundling is, I think, going to reach its zenith, I think, quite soon because there's, I think, a limit to how many individual people everyone wants to like pay for. You know what I mean? Like, you're how many like subscriptions are you going to have? I think right now, like, the most people have not even come into contact with the newsletter subscription business. So like we're still really like expanding that entire market. You can see this with Substack is growing, like Ghost is growing, Patreon is getting into the game of newsletter subscriptions. Like, I think we're still really in early days yet, but like eventually we're going to see a rebundling. And that's why I think when you see the leaderboard on Substack, for instance, it used to all be individuals, the top of the US politics one. But as you mentioned, it's really become bundled institutions recently, like the Free Press, the Bulwark, Zateo, Midas Touch. And, the argument now is like climbing up the ranks too. And so, like, that to me is like indicative of also like people have, like, consumers have like a value proposition they're looking for where they want to see multiple writers for the same amount of money rather than getting like one writer for that subscription price.
Yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, like speaking of my own inbox is like full of too many newsletters, and then you're like, if they would
Yeah.
all just come together with one thing, and then you've like reinvented the magazine. Right. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. It sort of reminded me of like, in Succession, where like the kids come up with the idea of like, what if we got all of these individual writers and put them together? And everyone was like, that's a ridiculous idea. And I was like, well, maybe it wasn't such a ridiculous idea.
So
Yeah.
funny. They're
Um,
not serious people though, so.
yeah, that is true. It would have not worked whatever way. Yeah, yeah. I guess going back to liberalism, what is liberalism to you, and how do you see it, as being part of your publication?
Yeah, I'm about to like any answer I give you is gonna like piss off like 5,000 philosophers. So I'm just signposting that for them. Yeah, so I mean, like, to me, liberalism is the answer to the question, how do we live with one another in a world of difference? And there's like the obvious differences, like racial differences, religious differences, gender differences, whatever it is, but also ideological ones. Like, even in very homogenous countries, ethnically, culturally, etc., you see differences pop up because that's what humans do. We differentiate ourselves from our communities by personality, by interest, by political orientation, by openness to experience. Like, all these different things differentiated us, and it's like what makes us human. And liberalism is like, okay, I believe that we need to be okay with this difference and figure out a way to live together. So how do we create institutions that respect the individual freedom of every person to be different? And that answer is like actually like very contentious, like, right? Like, because I actually think implicitly most cultures and most political systems throughout history have said, no, the trick is like to be homogenous, that like one of these groups has to win and then impose its view on everyone else, whether it's, Protestantism or Catholicism, like one of these things has to win, or a certain type of Protestantism has to win, or like, even ideologically, like you have to be a socialist or you must be a conservative, you must be a capitalist. Like, these are views that like most people have, that like you should actually just have to indoctrinate most of the people in your community, and that like it's not okay to have this level of pluralism. So liberals are people who believe that not only is that difference acceptable, but that it's good, that it makes the world a better place, and that we need to create political, cultural, and social institutions that are accepting of that difference and also allow those differences to exist without actually hurting other people. So like the fact that I'm a Christian and I believe certain things about the world and about God does not mean that I get to impose that on other people. Like, that does not, my ability to exercise my faith should not be in contest with other people's ability to be atheists or whatever it is. And so, like, this is the big question. And I think that's why it's like we call ourselves the argument, is that like, I don't think there's actually one answer to like how you create these institutions, but there is like one core animating belief, which is that like this pluralism is good and we're going to figure out a way to make it work.
Yeah. So we'll talk about sort of living together in political community in a bit, but just to stay with the sort of question of like liberalism and the publishing industry in particular. So like, I guess the excitement and the buzz in the media industry in the last few years has generally been around publications that are either kind of like anti-liberal or like post-liberal, or like at least view liberalism as kind of like naive or insufficient or something, right? So like, I'm thinking of like, say, on the left, something like Jacobin, for instance, which is like quite critical of like, mainstream liberals from like a socialist perspective, or like, say, something like the Free Press on the right, right? And like such critics would say that like the mainstream media is default liberal. So like they would present themselves as like countercultural, right? So do you think the mainstream media is actually liberal? And like can a liberal publication like The Argument like carve out a unique niche in that media landscape?
So, I mean, this is the difficulty with this word because it's come to mean so many things. Like, I do agree that most mainstream media defaults to left of center cultural and social and political positions. I don't think that it has actually lived up to like the core tenets of liberalism because I think that like there was actually a real widespread failure among people who called themselves liberals to live up to these views, and I count myself in this. In over the course of at least American politics in recent years. I mean, I think the election of Barack Obama, who is like the greatest president of my lifetime for sure. He I think convinced a lot of us, and I was very young when this happened, but like that we kind of had an inevitability. We kind of thought like this is it, this is permanent victory for liberalism. Like we've elected this black president, it is a triumph of racial liberalism. We're going to then elect Hillary Clinton. It'll be a triumph over anti misogynistic forces in this country, and it will be proof positive that like this project has just won. And the thing about liberalism is that if you start believing in permanent victories, you immediately like stop being liberal. Like, like once you start believing that your viewpoint is inevitable, that basically means that you think that there is no room for reasonable disagreement. It means that you don't think it's possible that a person reasoning well, thinking with good intentions, who just comes from a different position than you, could have like a reasonable point of view. And once you do that, like once you actually fully feel that way, I really do think that you've just sort of given up on the core tenets of liberalism. So like there are a bunch of these institutions that I think call themselves liberals, have a bunch of people who are well-meaning in many different ways, but like I really don't think that they have lived up to it in various respects. And I think that was a widespread failure amongst American liberalism. And so when I think about the value of something like The Argument, I mean, when I think of these small digital publications or small publications in general throughout, in particular, American history, with which I'm most familiar, the way that they have an impact is not that they become the size of the New York Times. They don't like grow to the level of like this kind of like hegemonic, media empire. But what they do is that they are essentially so the critique they lodge is so incessant and pointed and persuasive that things like the National Review from the neoconservative side in mid-century of the United States, mid-century mid 20th century, or the New Republic in the 1910s, or Public Citizen, or any one of these publications. I mean, even more recently, the American Prospect here, which is end up having a real outsized influence on both media, how it's done, and also politics, because it's willing to platform kind of a new perspective and really able to push that into the elite conversation. And that to me is the goal here. Is that like I think that my end goal is that like we are able to affect how these larger media institutions do their jobs and think about politics. We are able to get in front of people who are in local government, people who are activists, people who are in policy work here in Washington D.C., and that those people have a real influence over the larger cultural milieu and are able to and we're able to imbue these principles yet again. And so that is my goal. And so I think that is like eminently possible, and I do think that it comes out of like an existing failure of liberal institutions.
Yeah, just for viewers at home, the American Prospect is in fact different to the UK-based Prospect magazine, which you can see up here behind me. Moving out of like just media, but just like generally, I guess like liberalism has in some circles become a kind of like dirty word though in the last like decade or so, right? And like I guess there's a question of like why and what liberals can do about it. And like my hunch is that like part of it, particularly from like certain circles on the left, is that people sort of conflate liberalism with like moderate centrism, right? Like should they conflate those things in your mind?
This is such a good question. I'm actually writing an article right now, which is just, is liberalism just centrism? And it's the answer to me is like, no, obviously not. I mean, I think liberalism is like an extremely radical proposition. Like the idea that there are people who are very, very different than you, people who are Trump supporters, people who are, and if you're like on the left, if you are people who are different religions, people different nationalities, that like all these people can and should coexist together, and that it is better that they do so. Like this is like the most radical proposition in the history of humanity. Like every single force attempts to pull you away from this all the time. That like individuals should have the right to make decisions that the community finds as weird or bad, and that they shouldn't face undue consequences for it. Like that to me is not moderate. It's not centrist. I do think the reason why these things have gotten conflated is that liberalism like had kind of won. Like there was like a hegemonic moment, right? Like in the post-war era where like liberalism was super ascendant, and that these ideas kind of became in the water. Like even, Ronald Reagan was very pro immigration and markets, and there was like a real failure in a lot of these places to address other concerns. And as a result of that, I think liberalism, there were correct critiques that liberalism had failed on many respects to like meet the goals of what this ideology was supposed to provide. And I think that those critiques are well taken. The problem to me is that a lot of the people who I think are pushing for a post-liberal or anti-liberal perspective, I genuinely feel it's like you're really gonna miss it when it's gone, buddy. That's my perspective here. Like liberalism really comes out of like what like is reified in moments where like really horrendous shit happens worldwide. Like the European wars of religion happen, and that's when you really start seeing a liberal resurgence, where like millions and millions of people are killed on the European continent as a result of religious and national conflict over religion. And then in the post World War II moment, that's when you again see liberalism on the rise again, because people just see like the horrors of a world where you have abandoned these principles and goals. And I really, really don't want it to be the case that we need some like epical, like horrific world crisis to make us feel like we have to return to these principles. But I do think that that is one of the things that seems consistent throughout history, is that like that's often what it takes to remind people of what it means to lose these principles and this outlook on the world. And so to me, like I think that like there's like a I don't I come from a more progressive tradition myself, but I think that there are this entire project is one of pluralism, like an ideological pluralism. Like we've platform people who are conservatives, we platform people who are socialists, we have staff writers who are socialists, or sorry, we have columnists who are socialists, and ones who are considered moderate. Like these are things where I think all of these perspectives can provide value, because they have to. They're existing in our democratic populace, and you have to include them.
Yeah, so you mentioned the word like post-liberal there. I feel like that gets bandied around in the US a bit more than the UK. Where I've heard it is mostly associated with certain groups on the right in the UK, sort of national conservative types. And I've even heard like say JD Vance, for instance, engage with these kind of post-liberal thinkers. I guess on the left, there's another tradition which like they probably wouldn't like self-identify as like post-liberal, but like in a similar way, they kind of like define themselves in opposition to liberalism in some way. And so I'm interested to hear if you could like talk through these two groups in the US of sort of post-liberal thinkers, where you're sort of like drawing distinctions with these post-liberal groups and their thinking at the moment.
Yeah, so I think obviously to me, like the greatest threat to liberalism right now is the post-liberal right, and that's for a few reasons. One is that they are actually the ones ascendant and in power right now. But secondly, I think they're much more organized as an ideological coalition to oppose liberalism. I mean, when you think about these writers, but also like Vice President, as you mentioned, Vice President JD Vance has said that he is on the post-liberal right. And like these are people who genuinely believe that like individualism, that the right of an individual to make decisions that are different than the community is like suspect, and that community should have a lot more control and power over individuals' ability to exert their own freedom. And that to me is like a non-starter proposition. It's like both as an American, but as just like as a person as well. And so I mean, you see this in many different ways. I mean, you see this in like wanting to see much more return to, I think, outdated gender norms and roles, and that like women, for instance, are better serving their communities if they're like not working full-time jobs. They are staying at home and taking care of their children. And again, like that's a completely valid choice if someone wants to make it, but I just don't want my government telling me that that's like the right choice to be making or that I should be making that choice. And I think there's like versions of this on the left, which I think are much less uh they're much more inchoate. Like I think they're still kind of like the ideas are really there. Like there's a lot of illiberal ideas, particularly around speech norms, like the idea that like we should allow different individuals to speak about ideas that we find controversial, and silencing of different ideas has become very normal on the left, and that's kind of like a very illiberal idea. But I think the most interestingly complicated illiberal ideas on the left are mostly in the form of economic policy, where you see sort of a hostility towards business and profit making that is goes beyond wanting to create free fair markets and towards a level of believing that anyone making any profit whatsoever is suspect. And it's like a very bizarre sort of framework because it's like not super coherent a lot of the time, because like okay, so like we need more housing in the United States because we have a housing crisis. Like someone has to build that housing. Like it's going to be a housing developer. Like 90% of the country lives in privately created and constructed housing. And yet there is this weird strain of people on the left who like both live in like privately constructed market rate housing and also oppose any developer making money off that housing. And it's like, okay, like I'm not really sure what you do with that perspective. It kind of just leads you towards the kinds of housing crises you see in these very progressive cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York City, Washington, D.C., where like they just don't build enough housing for people. And then you have like homelessness everywhere you turn. And I really think it's downstream of this larger anti-growth sentiment, anti-growth movement that I find to be very, very concerning. And I think that that like really characterizes a lot of the folks that I would consider part of like the post-liberal, anti-liberal left. I think that like there are versions of like liberalism that are like socialist that like believe in like much more government intervention into markets, and that you could still have a lot of the viewpoints of liberalism. And I'm not a socialist myself, but I like we again, as I mentioned, we have socialists on staff who have those views. So I don't think being a socialist per se means you're illiberal, but I do think there's a lot of people on the left who are particularly not socialist, but who are very far left on certain issues, and have kind of abandoned these like larger ideas around pluralism and around trying to create markets that are free for and fair for people.
Yeah, so to get back to something you mentioned before, your opening essay for the argument was titled "How Do We Live with Each Other?" And particularly since the murder of Charlie Kirk, this is a topic that many in the US have been grappling with. There was an interesting exchange between you mentioned Ezra Klein. He spoke to Ta-Nehisi Coates on his podcast, both who have like kind of different perspectives on this, right? And the central like tension was like how and whether a liberal or progressive person should engage with someone or groups who they find that their views are repugnant, right? And so your essay was written before Kirk died. I'm interested to hear you sort of revisit that argument in light of the ensuing debate. Are you still sort of the same opinion, that we need to learn to live with each other, or have your views kind of evolved since then?
No, I mean, I feel the same. I mean, honestly, to me, I think the perspective of okay, well, like you need to draw lines around who you're willing to engage with or talk to. The presumption there is that me or anyone else has the ability to draw those lines in a way that is not just like wholly destructive to the world. Like to me, like I can't draw a line that cuts out people who like Charlie Kirk, even if I wanted to. Like that's I live in a country where like I go to the supermarket and we don't have ideological tests about who's going to be able to go to the same supermarket as me. And like that means when I have a pleasant conversation with the person next to me, they might be a Charlie Kirk supporter, they might be a Trump supporter. Like that's like normal life. And I like think it's really, really and I think that like obviously I take this all the way where I'm like, it's not just in like normal day-to-day interactions, but like even when you're talking about politics, like politics is the practice of figuring out how to create institutions that make the world a better place. Like, that's what we're trying to do here. Like, we're trying to organize the public body and figure out what to do with public resources in order to improve the lives of residents of this country and hopefully the world. And, to me, like, the idea that like you could have that conversation or you could do politics while excluding many people who are part of the public is genuinely just undemocratic behavior. Like, yes, I think that we should try. That's my goal, is like to persuade people that my positions on the world are correct. Like, I believe that people who are, people who are trans should have full rights to do what they want with their bodies and their lives, and they shouldn't be subject to the kinds of discrimination and the discriminatory conduct that I think that like people in Charlie Kirk's coalition have done. I don't think that we should have people who are opposed to racial egalitarianism. I think those ideas are bad and wrong. But like, once you agree that those ideas are bad and wrong, like, what's the goal? Like, is your goal to convince those people? Is it to drive them out of your country? Like, what are we trying to do here? And so to me, the people who are trying to say like we should just be drawing these lines and excluding people, I'm like, is your goal to like create a new country where like there's ideological tests of who's allowed to remain there? Because if that's not the goal, then like you're just preaching nihilism. And like, to me, that is like the most like dead end route for anyone who cares about these issues, particularly those of us who have the privilege to like speak in public, who have platforms, who have the ability to engage. Like, my goal is not to like sane wash Charlie Kirk or anyone like that. It's to say like, that's a person with power, with an audience who cares about these views. How do we engage with this person in a way that is actually productive for the ends that we have? And I don't think that I do think that it's the case that sometimes deplatforming is actually valuable and useful. I mean, we see this with I don't remember how to say his name, Milo Yiannopoulos, is that how you say his name? The really far right activist who got kicked off of Twitter and like just disappeared as a result of that. I'm not saying deplatforming never works, but like, I do think there's like, you should be careful when you deplatform people who end up having an actual audience, because then you just are deplatforming yourself. Like, you are just removing yourself from conversations that are actually where politics is happening. Like, right now, the left has lost cultural, social, political power. Like, the idea that who we have on our podcasts is really going to define what's happening in the future is, I think, kind of naive.
You've been watching part of an episode of the Prospect podcast. To watch the next chapter, click here, and to listen to the full episode, click the link in the description below. To read or listen to more of Prospect's journalism, go to prospectmagazine.co.uk.